Recently, I received an email from Dennis, who lives in Switzerland. Hi, Dennis. And he was asking about moving from a DSLR to the Sony mirrorless cameras. And he wrote, I'm thinking leaving the world of DSLR to Sony mirrorless. And in parentheses, he says he's owned the Canon 70 Mark II and now the Nikon D500. My last doubts are concerning the ergonomics, parentheses, the small buttons, and the robustness differences of these two systems. How are your thoughts and experiences about it? And then later in the message, he also says that because of where he lives, he wears gloves when shooting outdoors for a portion of the year. So Dennis, thanks for the email. And this is actually something that I myself have been wanting to talk about in a video already, so it's good timing. While I haven't used the Nikon D500 you have, I have owned the 70 Mark II as well as other Nikon and other Canon cameras. So I do feel like I understand your concern because those DSLRs do feel really nice in your hand, and it can be hard to give that up. While Sony's internal camera technologies are really great and probably a step above anything that a DSLR can provide, I'll be straight with you and say that almost everything physical about them is going to be a step down from where you're at. Specifically, you want to know about the small buttons and how this all plays out with gloves, as well as the difference in robustness, and those are going to be the things that I have wanted to talk about already in a video, so here it is. So when I first bought the Sony a7R IV, I gave up the Canon 1DX to do so, and that's probably the most ergonomically amazing camera that I've ever used. However, there's definitely a novelty about having a lot of firepower behind a smaller form factor with the Sonys, and that can be just as nice, but in a different way, if that makes any sense. I can see how either side could prefer having one over the other. You either got the ergonomic and aesthetic perfection with the Canon and Nikons, but at a size and weight cost, or you can have smaller and lighter, but it's harder to hold in your hand and use controls. So these two seemed evenly weighted until winter came here in Wisconsin and the thick waterproof gloves came on. Suddenly, I loathed going out and using my Sony. So your concern is justified with the buttons because I find that they're not really glove friendly, for me at least, and a few of them stand out as being the worst offenders. And first up is going to be the shutter button, which I'm constantly not feeling through my gloves, and I always find myself pressing the on-off switch area in front of it instead. So there's always a couple of seconds where I'm thinking, what the heck is going on and why isn't the camera firing, before I remember to relocate my finger more top side of the camera. Next is the multi-selector joystick, which is a little too finicky for me. It's hard to feel exactly how the thumbstick is being manipulated, and it also shares a similar problem I have with the control wheel below it, which is that the press button function, even when disabled or set to not set in the menu, overrules the stick or wheel movement. So what I mean by that is if you inadvertently put too much pressure on the multi-selector as you're trying to move it one direction, the camera registers that as a button press only and does not take into account the stick movement. Scrubbing the control wheel is the worst offender in winter because of another issue I have with it too, and that is that it's too small and slippery, and some gloves literally can't scrub it because there's not enough traction. At the start of winter, I bought and returned a few different gloves since they either didn't have the traction needed to turn the wheel, weren't warm or waterproof enough, or they didn't have enough dexterity to feel around the camera and lens controls. It's tough finding something that works for all three, and the gloves I own now are more of a compromise than a solution to the problem. And what sucks is that this low traction can't be solved by pressing in harder as you scrub, because that registers as a D-pad button press to the camera even if all four directions are disabled in the menu. Even while wearing gloves with grippy enough fabric for the wheel, I still struggle with feeling the fine line between scrubbing the wheel and pressing down too hard where it thinks I'm pressing a button. The control wheel is where I'm adjusting the ISO, so it's critical this wheel works very fast and accurate, but it's not even close on both counts. Even though I don't prefer it most of the time, I've had to change my shooting style this winter to incorporate auto ISO instead and use the exposure compensation dial on the top of the camera, since that's much easier to manipulate with gloves. Those are my main issues with the buttons, but there's also a couple other things with the camera that bothers me when using gloves, such as the tilting screen and the grip. And so for Dennis, I'm not sure if the D500 is any better about this, and of course the 70 Mark II didn't have a tilt screen at all, but on the Sony mirrorless cameras, trying to flip up the screen while wearing thick gloves is never not frustrating. I've learned that approaching it from the side will absolutely not work, and going at it from the bottom It's slow, but it will eventually catch enough of the ridge to pry it up. And then finally for the grip, what sucks is that if I use a lens coat on my 200-600 lens plus gloves, my fingers can no longer physically hold the grip in a regular, comfortable fashion. There's just not enough gap there, and really all that situation is simulating is what if I had larger fingers and a bigger hand, as some people actually do. Now I know how they feel about using Sonys all the time. I really hate that Sony hasn't taken their camera chassis designed around real human hands like the A99 and placed mirrorless internals inside of it, but I'm looking forward to what the A7R10 has in store for that. All that said, when it comes down to fleeting moments out in the field that I sense are about to happen, I will actually remove my right glove, even in terribly cold conditions, just so that I can manipulate everything on the camera at the moment I need it. And of course, that is ridiculous. Photographers shouldn't have to modify their controls or switch up shooting styles or remove clothing just so that their camera will cooperate. So this is kind of where my head's been at concerning the move to Sony. 4 or 5 months here, it's thick glove weather, so it's definitely got me thinking of how I want to move forward. Winter is on its way out soon, so I'll be back to not really having to be concerned about these things for a while, but I also don't want to build an expensive kit around a flawed camera for my uses, so right now I'm thinking in a few months I might move back to Nikon or Canon DSLRs, but nothing is totally certain. Thanks again, Dennis, for sending in the question. Hopefully that gave you something to think about to help you decide. I know you said that you wanted to get your hands on the Sony before buying, which is probably the best way to go for anyone making a big commitment like switching camera systems. I did do that, but it was also in the summer, so I never factored in the winter usage, which is too bad on my end, but perhaps it won't be too much of an issue for someone else that wears thinner or non-waterproof gloves. Thank you for watching, everyone. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.